Hi, welcome to Advanced Judaism for Beginners on the topic of Lo BaShamayim, Part 3. My name is Ashi, and thank you for joining us. In the last video, we discussed the topic of Lo BaShamayim, where the question is, to what extent do we and should we rely on divine intervention in the process of learning halakha? And last week, we brought two opinions. One opinion is of the Tosfot, where he holds that sometimes we do rely on divine intervention. And we brought another opinion of the Rambam, Maimonides, where what seems, based on his wording, is that his position is that we can never rely on divine intervention to derive halakha. And he says that we must always follow the understanding, the logic of the Chachamim, of the sages, as they understand the Torah. And again, of course, the sages follow the framework which we received at Mount Sinai. So that's the two positions and the two opinions that we discussed last week. This week, before I'm continuing on this topic, I just wanted to take a few minutes and discuss a little bit of history, to give a little bit of historical background to the names that I'll bring out throughout the series, and to bring different perspective on how the Jewish Torah, the oral Torah, was being passed down from generation to generation. So in this discussion, I would like to discuss the timeline of the various eras, the historic periods of the rabbis, the sages, who passed down from generation to generation the oral Torah. Now I'm going to discuss briefly a few of those eras. Some I'll skip a little bit. I'll just mention them by name. I'm going to skip them. One, to be honest, I'm not so familiar with them. I should. So hopefully, whenever I'll gain more knowledge on those eras, I'll come back to you. And I'm also skipping them because in the discussion of halakha, they're not going to be as quoted as much. So that's another reason. So that traditionally, when we discuss the oral Torah, we speak about it from the time of the Zugot, of the period of pairs, which is 200 BC, approximately, before Common Era, until about the year 0. And this Zugot mean pairs. Now, why do we start there? So, again, just very briefly, we have the written Torah, that is the 5 books of Moses, the prophets and the writings. Those were compiled in the middle of the era of the Second Temple. The sages at the time compiled it, and they completed Bible, and they said, this is the Bible, this is it. And essentially, the reason why they stopped it there, because essentially prophecy stopped then. So there was no longer the era of prophecy, and now the oral Torah is being transmitted throughout the sages, throughout Chazal, throughout the generations. And that first era was the Zugot, literally means pairs. And the reason for that name is that during that time, the Jewish religious leadership was essentially split between two positions, the head of the Sanhedrin and the Av Beit Din. Those are the two. And for example, a very prominent example of that, which we discussed before, is Hillel and Shammai. That's just one example. That era finished at the year 0. Then we have the era of the Tannaim. Those are the rabbis of the Mishnah. Now, very important to understand what completes an era, what ends an historic time period in the Jewish oral tradition, is essentially there are two components that ends an era. One is that there is a big change in the Jewish community, in the Jewish population, in their movement, in their meaning essentially that the learning centers has shifted in a different geographical area. And a second factor that completes an era is that usually there's a giant of a figure, a rabbinic figure, that his greatness is so recognizable throughout the Jewish community that everyone accepts its authority, and that figure, his authority, and the authority of whatever that person compiles. And I'll explain. That's a general two rules. A change in the geography, in the demographic and the geography of the Jewish population, and figure who comes across, rises, and the general Jewish population accept his authority. So the Tannaim period, which started in the year 0 and ended in the year 200, it ended with Judah the prince, essentially completing the Mishnah. And this is the first time that the Oral Torah was actually written. And the reason for Judah the prince, Yehuda Nasi, to compile the Mishnah at those years, at the year coming to the year 200 AD, that was after the all the Judeo-Roman wars. And unfortunately, the Jewish population, of course, in the year 73, I believe, AD, Beis Hamikdash, the Second Temple, was destroyed, and then followed by series of wars between the Jews and the Romans until about 160 AD with the Bar Kokhba revolt, the final Judeo-Roman war. And that, of course, unfortunately caused a lot of it, whichever Jews survived those wars, to flee the land of Israel, and the population shifted mainly to Babylon, also to other places in the Roman Empire, but the Jewish study-centered study yeshivot, the study halls, all moved to Babylon. So during that time, Judah the prince, as he saw these changes, and he saw that Judaism essentially was being decentralized from the center in the land of Israel to the diaspora, he said, in order for Judaism to survive, we need to compile the Mishnah. So he compiled the Oral Torah, which essentially it's a series of laws. The Mishnah are a series of laws that were being compiled. And once Judah the prince compiled that completed the era of the Tannaim. So again, we have the movement, the geographic shift from the land of Israel to the diaspora, mainly to Babylon. And then we also have that Jews accepted the authority of Judah the prince and the Mishnah. Then we have the period of the Amoraim. And Amoraim, those were the rabbis that were called, mainly they were in Babylon, also some remained in Eretz Israel, in the land of Israel. And they are the rabbis that are mainly being discussed in the Talmud. The Talmud essentially is a compilation of series of books and a series of discussions that were being discussed throughout Babylon in those centuries. Again, we're talking about from the 3rd century through the 6th century of Common Era. That's Amoraim. Then we have two more periods, the Savoraim and the Geonim, that I'm a little bit less familiar with, to be honest. I do want to say that Savoraim are being viewed very often by historians as just an extension of the Amoraim period. And then we have, so that ends about in the 7th, 8th already, century AD. Then we have reached the era of Geonim. Geonim is an era that takes us till the year 1000. And the Geonim, again, I'm a bit less familiar with that era. They did not discuss in great the Talmud, interesting enough. We do have, for example, the very first Siddur, the prayer books that we have comes from the era of the Geonim. So we're very much influenced by the era of Geonim. And of course, there are very famous ones by Saadia Gaon, Hai Gaon, Shira Gaon. They're very famous Geonim. And they did indeed leave us different books and their writings and their traditions. Just, I'm a bit less familiar with them. Now, and you'll see shortly why. Then we have the Rishonim. So this is talking about from the year 1000 AD. Now, the Geonim, throughout the Geonim, the Jewish center, the Jewish life, at least the learning life of Judaism, still remained in Babylon. So in Babylon, we're talking about that the Jewish center is there for about 800 years. Then due to series of wars between Babylon and the Persian Empire and then the Mongols. So the Jewish demographic shifted to Europe. That's in the year 1000 AD. And again, there were already Jews in Europe beforehand. Throughout the Roman Empire, there were Jews throughout the Mediterranean. But speaking about the center of Jewish life, the center of Jewish study, that changed to Europe in the year 1000 AD. And then comes the Rishonim. Now, the Rishonim are called the firsts, and indeed, they went back to the Talmud, and they analyzed and studied in depth again the Talmud, and were heavily influenced by the Talmud. And that's why, indeed, I'm more familiar with them, because, for example, if we think about Rashi, Tosfot, and other ones we mentioned, Maimonides, Nachmanides, they were all in the time of the Rishonim, essentially from the year 1000 for 500 years to the year 1500 approximately. That was the era of the Rishonim. And again, I mentioned a few of those names there. And that is then also what started the split that we know of in Judaism today between Sephardim and Ashkenaz. Now, again, there were always some sort of a split in terms of the tradition, of customs. There was a Talmud Bavli and Talmud Yerushalmi. But the split that we know of as Sephardim and Ashkenaz started with the era of the Rishonim in the year 1000, when the Jewish center shifted to Europe, mainly to Ashkenaz. That's the border of France and Germany. That became the base of Ashkenaz. And then we have in Sfarad in Spain. That lasted for about 500 years until the expulsion of Spain. And again, the second component of what completed the Rishonim is the Reb Joseph Caro, that I'll discuss him in some other time. He was actually 4 years old. He was expelled from Spain. He was 4 years old during the expulsion of Gerush Sfarad. During the expulsion of Spain, he was 4 years old, and eventually he moved to Tzfat, to Safed, and he wrote the Shulchan Aruch, which is what's called the set table, and he organized the Oral Torah. So he essentially completed the era of the Rishonim, and all Jewish communities accepted his authority. Sephardim communities, meaning the communities throughout the Muslim world, throughout the Ottoman Empire, accepted his halachic authority of Rabbi Joseph Caro. And Ashkenaz communities in Europe, in Christian Europe, they accepted also his authority, but with the tweaks, with the additions of the Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserlich, which we'll cover him also in a different video. So we see here also that what completed the era of the Rishonim, again, two things: shifting in a Jewish population, the expulsion from Spain, and acceptance of authority of a giant leader in the Jewish community. That was Rabbi Yosef Karo and Rabbi Moshe Isserlich per the Ashkenaz tradition. Now, there's one thing I missed as well. When I spoke to the era of the Amoraim, again, that's the era of the Talmud, which is about, we're talking about from the 3rd century to the 6th century of Common Era. So there, what completed there is also, there were a bunch of wars between some Persian empires and Babylon empires that caused a great decline in the Jewish study, in the Jewish yeshivot in Babylon. And that caused, again, two giant of leaders, Rav Ashi and Ravina, not related. My name is Ashi, but not related. So Rav Ashi and Ravina, who completed the Talmud. So all Jewish communities accepted the authority of the Talmud. So those are the time period, different times, and we have the time of the Acharonim that we lived during that time. The Acharonim. That's after Rabbi Yosef Karo compiled his book Shulchan Aruch in the early 16th century till today. Just a thought that I have is it's interesting. Unfortunately, of course, the Holocaust in the last century, of course, it caused a huge shift in Jewish population out of Europe. Unfortunately, during Judaism that we know of as for 1,000 years, Unfortunately, it's gone. Then Jews returned to the land of Israel, which that's again a huge shift in that population. But what seems is that we don't have that giant yet that everyone recognize his halakha, that we follow strictly his halakha. And we see today that we have different traditions. So therefore, we're still within that era of Acharonim. That's per my understanding. I did hear once in a while that I did hear some opinion hold that we are in a different era, something called melaktim, that we're doing the times of the collectors, but I'm not sure about that. Typically, we're being referred to that we're in the time of Acharonim. So, okay, so I took those minutes, and I'm going to share that timeline just to give a very brief background to that. So now, going to our topic, in the topic, again, of Lo BaShamayim, to what extent in the understanding of halakha do we rely on heavenly intervention? So I wanted to bring the HaRan today, Rabbi Nissim Gerondi, okay, from the city of Altaiz in Spain. Let's see, from the city of Girona or Girona in Catalonia. So Rabbi Nissim, he was in Catalonia, and so he was probably a big Barca fan. It was just a joke, just kidding. Chaz v'shalom. But Rabbi Nissim the HaRan, he was called the HaRan. Again, so going back to our era, he was in the time of the Rishonim. He lived from between the year 1290 to the year 1376. In our discussion of Lo BaShamayim here, I would like to bring his opinion. Just one moment, please. Yeah, as I'm scrolling up, I do want to thank actually the curriculum I use. It comes from a website called olamot.net. It's a website in Hebrew. It's a great, if someone masters the Hebrew language, it's a great database of various curriculums, various shiurim. They're great, and I use their curriculum, so giving the credit to olamot.net. So, like this, I'm going to read Drashas HaRan. So, again, this is from the HaRan. Let's see what he says about the concept. וכבר עמו בבא ומציע, בעניין רבי אליעזר ורבי ישוע. עמד רבי ישוע על רגליו ואמר לו בשמיים היא. As we learned in our first session, in the story of Rabbi Eliezer invoking the miracles, we have Rabbi Yeshua standing on his feet and saying, it's not in heaven. מה לא בשמיים היא? כבר ניתנה לנו משה על הר סיני. And what does it mean that it's quoting, it's not in heaven? By the way, that quote comes from the 5 books of Moses, from the Torah itself. So what does it mean? So it means is that it's not in heaven because God already gave Moses the Torah at Mount Sinai, and it already says in it that we need to follow the majority in a question of halakha. Just a quick, if I can just add a quick joke, I'm sorry, I have to throw it in. I just remembered. They once asked, I heard about this Rabbi Yonis and Oibshitz. They asked him, if the Torah tells us we need to follow the majority, then seemingly the majority follows Christianity. So maybe we should follow Christianity as well, following the majority. So Rabbi Yonis and Oibshitz answered very wisely. He says, when it says we need to follow the majority, that's when we have a doubt. When we have a doubt, then we need to follow the majority. But then if we have no doubt, then we even don't follow the majority. If the majority at daytime telling you it's nighttime, don't follow them. When we have a legitimate doubt in halakha, then we need to follow the majority opinion of halakha. Just a cute thought on that. But back to the HaRan. Now, so far we just quoted what we already learned. Now let's see what the HaRan adds to our discussion. Ba'pirush etzlihu, and the explanation by me is, the wise person, the wise sage, is going to resolve any doubts we have, and that is the foundation of it all, that the wise rabbi, the wise person is going to resolve all our doubts. The Yishma Elav Hanavi al Kocha, and the prophet would need to listen to the rabbi, to the wise one. ואם הנובי יוער לחכם דבר במשפט התורה שיביאו מצד נבואתו, לא ישמע אליו כלל. And if the prophet will bring his position based on his prophecy, we should not listen to him. We should listen to the rabbi. So the prophet, the HaRan says, the prophet needs to obey the rabbi. Divine intervention needs to obey the logic. And again, this is based on the rule from the Torah. הנה, ראו כולם שרבי אליעזר מסכים אל האמס יויסר מהם. Now here the Ran says very interesting wording that I found in them fascinating. He says like this: all the sages saw that Rabbi Eliezer maskim el haemes yoser mehem. They saw that Rabbi Eliezer, who invoked all the miracles, was closer to the truth than they were. His position agreed with the truth more than their position. And all of his signs, his miracles that he did, are true and righteous. And all the sages saw that from heaven they agreed like Rabbi Eliezer. But despite that, the sages ruled in halacha. They did an action according to their position. In halacha, they did the ruling. They ignored the truth that Rabbi Eliezer showed them, and they went with their ruling. Because their mind, their logic told them that in the case of that oven, and again, we discussed it a little bit, that it was something there that their position should be to impure it. So Chachamim, the sages, saw that, okay, the truth, whatever that means, I should say, but the truth, the emes, is with Rabbi Eliezer. But our mind is telling us, our logic, based as we understand the Torah, telling us we should follow this. Now, the Ran adds and says, if the sages, based on the miracles, would have ruled halacha like Rabbi Eliezer, and they would do it based on being convinced based on miracles, that transgresses the Torah. Because the Torah instructs the sages to follow logic and not miracles. Because ruling of halacha was given over to the sages throughout generations, as we just went through the timeline. And as the sages would understand it, Hashem would agree with them. Fascinating. So I just found it fascinating how the Ran puts it in words that it's about the process of logic, of understanding of the halacha of the sages. And if the sages would not follow that process, they would transgress and they would go against the Torah, even though they're being revealed that the truth is otherwise. Again, it's very, I found it to be mind-blowing, very fascinating. So we'll complete the learning today. So we discussed just a summary of what we learned today. We discussed the history of the Jewish period, throughout the oral tradition. And again, there are two factors that completes one era and brings in a new era. One is at the shift of the centers of Jewish learning, and the second one is a acceptance of Klal Yisrael, of all communities, or at least majority of communities, of a certain halachic authority. And so we showed that throughout different eras, and we said that we mainly going to discuss the Rishonim from the year 1000 to the year 500, and the Acharonim onwards, and we're still in the era of Acharonim. And then back to the topic of Losh BaShamayim, we brought the Ran, where the Ran explains the idea that the sages in the ruling of halacha must follow their logic, their understanding of halacha, and if not, they're transgressing. Anyway, thank you everyone for joining, and have a great whoever you are. All the best. Until see you next time. And please, of course, like, subscribe, and share the channel. It's really helpful. Thank you.